And please join me in welcoming Governor Bill Weld.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here. I see old friends from the Libertarian Party, Nick Sarwark, the national chair. I understand that, I'm about to do a visual. I understand that Vermin Supreme is on the property, even if he's not right here, but one of my favorite, most dramatic libertarians. Just one thing that doesn't appear on my resume, this is a visual. I'm actually the international vice president of the Guggenheim Motorcycle Club, an honor which I won in a closely fought election in Bilbao, Spain, where the Guggenheim was opening a new exhibit, The Art of the Motorcycle, some years ago. But it gives you a sense that I do wander off the beaten path from time to time in terms of politics. When I used to write novels, the first rule is write what you know. And I thought I might talk a little bit this morning about stuff I do know about. We're going to have ample opportunity for Q&A thereafter. But when Mr. Trump was elected, I think there was hope in some quarters, even liberty-friendly quarters, that at least he wasn't Hillary Clinton, and so maybe things aren't so bad and they won't be so bad. And we've now had 2.5 years, and I've had 6 months at least for a close study of how policy is made and what the intentions are in the White House. And I'm kind of here to say, don't you believe it for a second. I mean, it's tempting to think that, but if you really parse what's going on in the White House and in Washington, D.C., it's not appealing from a liberty-loving point of view. And that is my point of view. I've said many times that ever since I was in law school, where I fell in love with the writings of Friedrich Hayek, particularly the Constitution of Liberty, that was my Bible, even more than the Road to Serfdom. I've considered myself at least a small L libertarian, and as you may know, I ran on the ticket with my good friend Gary Johnson, former governor of New Mexico, in the 2016 election. Gary and I had served together as Republican governors, he of New Mexico and me of Massachusetts, for 2 terms each, and we overlapped by 1 term. So I knew him for the iconoclast that he is, and quickly said yes when he asked me if I would like to be on the ticket. This cycle, after looking at everything that has been going on in the Trump administration, I thought that the better part of valor was to take the direct shot at Mr. Trump, so I'd be able to speak directly to and at him. So I'm running directly against him in the Republican primaries, led by New Hampshire, the most important primary of all, but nationwide as well. And for someone whose governing passion in life is a desire that government be smaller and that personal liberties and freedoms be maximized, I don't like what I see in Washington. I sometimes say that my sense of what's a democracy is it's a form of organization where the individual shall never be thrust in a corner. I say this with a heavy heart, but I think too often the first reaction of the current incumbent of the White House is, let's by all means thrust the individual into a corner so we can maximize the amount of power that's being centralized in Washington, D.C., and more particularly in my White House, Donald Trump's White House. I think it's not an accident that so many of the big cabinet agencies, state, defense, homeland security, have been hollowed out in the last 2.5 years. And by that I mean either secretaries were not appointed, or when they quit, they were not replaced, or people were kept in an acting position. Some departments have as many as 9 people in acting status, meaning they've not been confirmed by the Senate. I've had 3 stints in Washington, and I can tell you one thing for sure. If you have the word acting in front of your title, you have no power to get anything done whatsoever. The bureaucrats will say, we're just going to outweigh you. And the pols say, how come you haven't been confirmed? So the result of this is that there are power vacuums in those big national security-oriented cabinet agencies, and power abhors a vacuum. So of course what happens is that power devolves back to the Oval Office and Donald J. Trump. And there's been a disquieting history of Mr. Trump making remarks about how nice it would be if we didn't have to have primaries, even if we didn't have to have elections, ha ha ha. And now I'm looking forward not to my second term, but my third term, ha ha ha. And isn't it great that Xi Jinping, the leader of China, succeeded in getting rid of elections in China? What a great idea, ha ha ha. It just goes on and on and on, and it's not a joke at all. I do think that Mr. Trump aspires to be the man on the white horse, the man on horseback who rides in to save us all. But when he gets there, what's he going to do? It very much revolves around Donald J. Trump and the maximization of his ego, finances, family success. He has said recently to the members of Congress, the leading members of Congress, look, you can either investigate or you can legislate. But if you're going to investigate me or my family or any member of my administration or anything to do with my finances, including, of course, my personal in the United States, ever again, no matter what happens, it says nothing about whether they're going to go to jail or anything like that. So in one sense, it's not a scary remedy. But I do think that recently, the administration and Mr. Trump in particular has indicated that they find it very scary, and I think I know why. Because the way the system works, and I worked closely on the Nixon impeachment a generation ago. I was in charge of writing the book about what constitutes grounds for impeachment of a president. And we concluded it didn't have to be a crime. What if the president, went to another country and took up a life of pleasure and never came back to Washington? You'd have to remove that president because the job isn't getting done. And I propose that the job is not getting done now. So the only thing is that the president gets removed. But along the way, the House Judiciary Committee did conduct an investigation into the case of Mr. Nixon. And it was a pretty simple investigation. Did he know about or commission the Watergate break-in that led to these 10 people being prosecuted in the Watergate conspiracy that Mr. Nixon said he knew nothing about? So that's a very limited investigation. It took 10 months. So if the House Judiciary Committee said, tomorrow, we're going to start an investigation, that would take until April or May of next year, by which time we probably would know who the nominees of the two major parties are going to be. Ideally, one of them would be me, and I would have nothing to fear, but just in case it didn't work out that way, it would be the Libertarian candidate, of course, and whoever else was in the finals, the R, the D, and the L. So that's well into the election cycle. And then the matter goes over to the Senate. And I think there's a popular misconception that the Senate immediately holds a vote. No. The House appoints 6 managers to prosecute the impeachment in the Senate, and that would take another 6+ months in a complex investigation such as this one. So the whole thing would run through the election. Meanwhile, you'd have nothing between now and then except an investigation which can produce Mr. Trump's worst enemies, and I'll close with this. And his worst enemies are not his political opponents. His worst enemies are facts. Facts are stubborn things. You can't really get around them once they've been proved and accepted as facts. And there's a lot of palaver and a lot of ducking and covering that goes on in Washington. But when you have a very serious investigation with the whole world watching and the right of cross-examination and putting on witnesses under oath and subpoenaing documents, facts have a way of getting established. I know this because I spent 7 years under Ronald Reagan in the Justice Department, and I was head of the criminal division of the Justice Department in Washington, so I was in charge of all criminal matters, and they do have a way of reaching finality. That's why I've recently changed my position on impeachment and said, yeah, it is time to get on with that. But I think the end game, if Mr. Trump has his way, is that more and more power is going to devolve to him personally in the White House, which should be the opposite. If you look at what he's done on immigrants, on going after people individually right from the Oval Office. It's the opposite of how a liberty-loving president would act. That's my view anyway. Anyway, that's my 10 minutes. I'm more than happy to answer any questions from the audience anybody might have. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Hello, Governor Weld. I'm actually, we met before when you were visiting Lewiston, Maine. It's good to see you here.
Great, love Lewiston. I was there 5 times in the last cycle. It's a freedom-loving place.
But I'm Eric Brakey, a former state senator from Maine, who was actually last year the Republican U.S. Senate nominee. And I appreciate having you here. I think certainly there's truth to some of the things you say there. President Trump, when we look at him from a libertarian perspective, he's probably at, depending on your perspective, it's either glass half full or half empty. But as far as 2 policy areas I'd like your perspective on. First of all, where do you stand on our gun rights, generally speaking, and as far as the Trump administration's executive order banning bump stocks, where do you stand on that? And also, I know recently you were critical of the Trump administration's handling of the situation in Iran. I'm curious how you would handle things differently.
So on guns, I got deeply into that issue running as a libertarian and came to understand it's not about hunting, it's not about hunters, it's about self-defense. And during that campaign and since, I've read widely in history as to what happens when a society makes it virtually impossible to own a gun, or certain members of society. And what happens is that the people who are not allowed to own guns get annihilated. They get slaughtered. A case in point is Nazi Germany, where Hitler made it impossible for Jews to own a gun. So when the knock came on the door, they had no way to defend themselves or to resist at all, and they were taken to the gas chambers and slaughtered. 12 million people, mostly Jews. Stalin's Russia, impossible to own a gun. 20 million people sent to the gulags in the east where they died. Not quite so quickly as in the gas chambers of Germany, but almost as much. But it's not just Hitler and Stalin. It's throughout the course of history. Probably the most brutal ruler of the 20th century was Idi Amin in Uganda, Africa. Impossible to own a gun. It's too much of a threat to national security. Therefore, we have to make it impossible to own a firearm. Within months, 50% of the country, namely all of his political opponents, were rounded up and slaughtered. Not even rounded up, they were just systematically slaughtered. And it goes back all the way to ancient times when it's impossible to own the means of defense. There's no bulwark against the government, and the government does what governments do. They say, this power tastes good. Maybe it would be fun to have even more power, i.e. no one criticizing us. Why do you think Mr. Trump says a free press is the enemy of the people? Enemy of the people is a Joe Stalin phrase, and Trump is using it to undercut the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, which is probably the most important part of the Constitution. And it was a condition of the Constitution being ratified, that the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, be adopted. I think the most important is the 10th Amendment, which says the powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved to the states and the people. Here is for the 10th Amendment. So, as to firearms, and I'm a lifelong hunter and gun owner, and I know about guns, unlike many reporters who couldn't tell you the difference between a rifle and a shotgun. I think all guns are dangerous. When I got my first little 20 gauge so I could go duck hunting, I had to take a hunter safety course. And I think everybody who gets a gun to go hunting should have to take a hunter safety course, or they're going to wind up trying to cross a fence with their gun not broken and blowing their own head off. I saw all those pictures when I was taking my hunter safety course. I got no problem with efforts to make guns and the use of firearms more safe and less likely to lead to a parkland type situation, or the worst of all, Sandy Hook. So, if there's an indication that there's a person in whose hands a gun might be dangerous to others, yeah, I'm okay for saying people with indicia of mental instability, there should be a check before they can go out and willy-nilly buy a firearm. But that's gun safety. That's nothing to do with gun ownership.
Does that extend to like red flag laws?
Well, it depends what's in the red flag law. So like if someone has a history of mental illness, yes. If the police chief doesn't happen to like them, no. You know, even in the past, I did come out in favor of gun rights as opposed to the caprice of a police chief who you know, in many states has unlimited power to say this person cannot own a gun. So look at it in the large. There are 300 million rifles in the United States out there in private hands, lawfully acquired. And occasionally a well-meaning person will say, well, we just need more information. So we'd like everyone to take their rifles and their shotguns in to just show them to the police chief once a year. And you know, he won't tap them, he won't touch them, he just wants to see them, and maybe he wants to know the serial number. Just bring it in once a year. Well, I know exactly what would happen if that were instituted. The first year, the police chief wouldn't do anything. The second year, he would say, you got 3 guns? That's kind of odd, buddy, why do you need 3 guns? The third year, the person would come in with their 3 guns and say, okay, I'm on my way now. And the police chief or somebody else would say, not so fast. You're leaving those guns right here for safekeeping. And I'm in my heart, I believe that would happen if such a regime were instituted. So you can color me a hawk on gun ownership, and it's for the most fundamental of reasons. I believe in a pluralist society. I believe in bulwarks against the government. And if the government can take your guns away, we're not safe at all. So that's it. That's the gun issue. And I'm happy to do the fine print on red flags and all that and answer detailed questions there. But that's where I come from, and that's where I stop. On Iran, you know, I'm not so sure the Iran deal was misguided, giving us 10 years when Iran would not have any progress towards a nuclear weapon. I'm a member of a society, a group of former world leaders. Everybody except me is the head of a country. I was the head of a state. I was just the head of one state, but I knew all these people from my international business travels. Jean Chrétien from Canada, Franz Franisky from Austria, Bertie Ahern I overlapped with in office from Ireland, so I knew a bunch of them. They elected me a member. We get together once a year to talk about the greatest issues of the day in the world and what chiefs of countries worry about when they go to sleep. And the residue, the top 4 issues are: number 1, nuclear non-proliferation; number 2, religious sectarianism, which is a euphemism for Sunni versus Shia in most parts of the world; number 3, water; and number 4, food. That's what responsible people who are in charge of populations worry about. Notice nuclear non-proliferation is number 1. I do think that this is something Mr. Trump does not understand. Very early in his presidency, he was playing nuclear poker with North Korea, and at one time it almost appeared that he was prepared to pull the trigger there if North Korea really kept acting belligerent by doing tests. And he would have said to the American people, it's a tragedy, but I had to do it to keep us safe. 12 million people are dead, but at least we're safe because they were working on a weapon that could have reached not just San Francisco, but also New York, so I had to take action to save us all. The whole thing would have been a put-up job, a hypothetical on his part, but that would not have been a step in the direction of nuclear non-proliferation. He's also suggested that Japan and South Korea should get their own nuclear weapons so they would be more of a deterrent to Russia's expansionary efforts in Asia, if any. That's not someone talking who understands that we got to have the ratchet going in one direction where nuclear weapons are concerned. So for Mr. Trump to tear up the treaty on day 1, without, I am sure, having read it or even understood it, without, I'm virtually certain, understanding that our allies in Europe were parties to the treaty, so it's not going to go away just because he rips it up. I think that was a colossal blunder, and it cost us a lot of flexibility in dealing with what is, admittedly, the most dangerous country. Well, maybe Iran and Saudi kind of tied. in the Middle East. But the idea of, oh, they shot down an unmanned drone, so I'm gonna send 1,000 more troops there. That's precisely the boots on the ground to foreign soil of our young men and women in uniform for the purpose of enforcing regime change, which is exactly what my old friend John Bolton, who's now the National Security Advisor, wants. He wants to goad the president into forcing regime change in Iran, and it has to be now part and parcel of what the president wants. So his instincts are not sound here, his sense of proportion is not sound. Boots on the ground to the Middle East is, if anything, a worse idea than more boots on the ground to Afghanistan. You know, Gary Johnson and I said in the last cycle, day one, Afghanistan troops come home. Question, why are they there? People give you answers, okay? So my follow-up question is, well, when should they ever come home? And the proponents of troops in Afghanistan don't have any answer. They should be there forever. Well, that's no way to run a railroad, in my opinion. So I think the president is way out ahead of himself. As usual, he's manufactured a crisis and then tries to take credit for avoiding it. Like, oh, there was just about to be a three-part invasion that would have killed 150 people, but I, Donald Trump, said no. That would be disproportionate to the amount of harm suffered by an unmanned drone being shot down. Well, you can agree with that, but where did the proposal for a three-part invasion to kill 150 people come from? It was made up as a straw man so he could look good. My view, anyway. Thank you.
Hi. My son Russell Drake is serving a double life sentence for all nonviolent charges. And actually, Gary Johnson told me twice that he would pardon us if he were elected. And I gave some information on the just for if you want to look into it later. My question is, what is your stand on criminal justice and sentencing reform and mass incarceration and these excessive sentences that are being given to thousands of people? And would you use the power of the presidency and clemency to give it some relief?
Yeah, yes, I certainly would. We have way too many people in jail, more proportionally than any other country in the world, including China and Russia. We have made way too many people, in particular, for possessory offenses involving cannabis and other narcotics. And the people who are in jail are mostly black or Hispanic. And if you're black, you're 4 times as likely to get arrested for possession of marijuana, not dealing, but possession. 4 times as likely to get arrested as if you're white. And if you're arrested, you're 4 times as likely to get a prison sentence than if you're white. And if you get a prison sentence, it's likely to be 4 times as long than if you're white. So that's a 64-to-1 ratio. And would I use my power to address that? Yeah, and I think I can prove it. I used my clemency power a lot when I was governor, mostly for narcotics and firearms offenses. Somebody wanted to get a job as a police officer, but they had a youthful conviction for something, and it might have even been marijuana, but they couldn't get a permit to carry a gun, so they couldn't be a police officer. Boom, pardon. Sounded good to me anyway. So I did it quite a lot, and I did it in minor narcotics offenses. I was a federal prosecutor for 7 years, but I didn't do these 2-ounce cocaine buy-bust cases. I would do only major trafficking cases. Now, the amount of people imprisoned for minor possessory offenses involving cannabis is staggering. And I'm sort of happy to say that the move to getting those people out of prison started with, believe it or not, Republican governors in the South, who maybe did this for the wrong reason, but they didn't want to pay $75,000 rent a year on prison for those folks. So that's where it started. But now criminal justice reform has taken on a life of its own, a good life. This is a good thing for once. Recently Washington passed something called the First Step Act, which was a step in the direction of criminal justice reform, but not enough. We need to address cash bail more than we have, and we need to go further than the amount of clemency that was embodied in the First Step legislation. I was watching a couple of nights ago on MSNBC show I was about to go on, and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey, who's, I'm no Cory Booker fan, too ambitious, et cetera, et cetera. But he was pretty persuasive about a law that he's proposed that would analyze the prison population, and anyway, it provides for the release, the immediate release through commutation to time served for, I think it's 17,000 people in the federal justice system, and it sounded absolutely persuasive. So you never know where your next coalition is coming from. You know, it may be one of the Democrats who's saying something that makes sense. So when I was in office, we had a whole bunch of women who'd been sent to prison for life for manslaughter, and they had killed the man they were living with, whether it was a boyfriend or a husband, in complete self-defense. And they had been beaten for years, so much so that they had like PTSD for returning veterans. So we looked into this, and we looked into the entire record of their trials. And we decided that there was such a thing as battered women syndrome, that these women had been battered for so long that, you know, they weren't, there was a ground to commute their sentences, because we couldn't be quite sure that they had the criminal intent necessary to support even a manslaughter conviction, much less a murder conviction. So I commuted all their sentences, free, out you go, and we held training sessions for all the judges in Massachusetts. You've got to understand there is such a thing as battered women syndrome so that you can recognize it. And when I started out as a lawyer, as many young lawyers do, I would sit in the back of the courtroom all morning waiting for my case to be called. So I would see these women come in on Monday morning, having been beaten within an inch of their life, and the judge would lean down and say, "Sweetheart, what did you do to irritate your boyfriend or your husband so much?" I saw it with my own eyes, many times. So when I said that happened and people said, "Oh, Governor, that didn't happen," I would tell them I saw it with my own eyes. So we hauled these judges in, and we had them trained by the police, by the cops. Boy, did the judges hate that, being lectured by the cops as to what goes on in the real world. But, you know, we made them understand if they wanted to continue being judges, this training was part of their responsibility. So the worm did turn, and you don't hear that these days, quite the contrary. And I worked with a woman named Wendy Murphy. You may have heard of her. She's a champion of women's rights and criminal justice reform, and she's very good at making things public and popularizing, and so am I. So we work together on this. So my heart is with you, and I do want to know more about your son. You said for nonviolent?
Yeah, it's all nonviolent charges. It's a fairly high-profile case. Can I follow up with you?
Yeah, please.
How do I do that?
Well, I got 4 guys here wearing Weld 2020 t-shirts. We're not allowed to campaign, but you can recognize them by their t-shirts.
They'll tell me how to get in touch with you?
Yeah.
Ask them to sign the petition.
Yeah. Once you look into it, we have a petition. It has over 175,000 signers now. Ross is
Why don't you just see me when I'm done talking?
Okay.
That way we can be sure.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll give you a card.
Free Ross. Free Ross. Free Ross.
Hi. During a New Hampshire primary, one comes to, I knocks at the door, she says, "I'm campaigning for Michael Dukakis for president." And I said, "I moved out of that damn state to get away from him." And then she said, "Yeah, I know, I hear that over and over." So, but after I saw you for a year in Massachusetts, and what you've done,
I was the opposite.
in just 1 year, I moved back to Massachusetts.
What a great story. Let's put this one in a bottle and sell it, guys.
Well, thank you for being here, Governor. In, I want to say it was 2013, Barry Johnson came here, did the same thing you're doing. He stood up in front of the crowd, which is pretty brave. We had a lot of fun with him during the Q&A. One question that we asked Gary Johnson kind of stuck out in particular, and it's still kind of one of the more memorable moments, I think, in all of Pork Fest. I'll give you the same question. And that's, if New Hampshire were to secede from the federal union, how would you handle that as president?
My first reaction is not hostility, let me put it that way. My personal motto is live free or die. I've spent a lot of time in this state over the years, and it's not an accident. So, you know, I know presidents from Lincoln on down generally take a dim view of secession, but I don't know, Nantucket or New Hampshire, I think that'd be worth careful consideration, honestly.
I've been very...
And by the way, I love the Free State Project, too. That to me is citizen initiative at its best.
I'm not paying a whole lot of attention to these Democrats, but I've been genuinely disappointed that people are not talking about Trump's trade policies, which are exceedingly dangerous and reversing settled trade routes around the world, and it's exploiting the American taxpayers and so on. And it's been a shock to me for the first time since World War II. This question of free trade and lower tariffs is now on the air. So my question is, will you speak out on this topic?
Yeah, no, I'm speaking out on free trade. It's not because we've always done it that way, me and my pappy and my grandpappy. It's because I can prove that it benefits the United States of America. We have by far the most productive workforce in the country, in the world, bar none. Way more productive even than China, who people think has some monopoly on technology. No, it's the United States that has that culture of productivity. And so when we trade freely, you know, no holds barred, just open trade, market prices with another country, we're always going to get the lion's share of high-wage jobs. We may export some low-wage jobs overseas, for example, making cars with Mexico under the North American Free Trade Agreement. The average car will go back and forth that southern border 22 times, depending what stage of production it's at. If it's at a stage that demands low-cost labor, it'll be done in Mexico, but the engineering and the high-end stuff comes back to Michigan or the United States. So we're always going to benefit from free trade, and when the president says, I'm going to slap a 25% tariff on everything coming in from Mexico, because I don't like Mexico today because of something the foreign minister said, you know, that will add $9,000 to the cost of every car being sold in the United States that was even partially manufactured in Mexico. And that's just not going to happen. But he says, this 25% thing, I'm going to do it, it's going to go in by October unless they give me X that I want. And then someone in the State Department a few days later says, maybe we can work something out with the Mexicans so this awful thing wouldn't come to pass. And President Trump would have saved us from this awful thing that he proposed. So come to find out, the agreement with the Mexicans had already been entered into months earlier, and that was kept a secret by the White House so that the president could get credit for avoiding this awful thing that almost came to pass. So it's a combination of him not knowing what he's talking about and being outwardly meretricious about not letting the American people know what's going on. But you know, free trade would be a real long, cool drink of water for the United States. The president's foreign policy seems to be threaten tariffs, threaten sanctions, focus on the negative, treating countries the way he treats people. Bullying. No way to run a railroad.
All right, so a little bit ago you talked about Nazi Germany taking away the guns from the Jewish people, and they did that under laws that were enacted in the Weimar Republic about the state being allowed to remove guns from people they deemed a danger to the state. And then shortly after you mentioned that, you brought up that you might be okay with saying that, well, maybe people shouldn't have guns if they have mental illness or whatever else. So the mental illness thing is about being a danger to yourself and to others, and to me, danger to the state versus danger to self and others feel functionally identical. And I don't understand how you don't see this as a horribly slippery slope that could lead to almost the exact same thing, because these were the laws that led directly to crystal meth. So.
Yeah, no, first thing I said in the campaign last time was the president's immigration policies reminded me of crystal meth, and they went wild. Look, Sandy Hook, the guy, was a known mentally ill young man whose mother said, I'm going to help him develop self-confidence by buying him every weapon, every piece of clothing that full-scale military used, so he could feel good about himself. She was the first person he killed at Sandy Hook before killing all the little kids. So you don't want a gun in that guy's hands. And you know, there are accounts of people who have mental illness, and they're not accounts that are written for the purpose of getting firearms out of their hands. They're written for the purpose of helping them, but then doctors occasionally will say this person is probably a danger to himself and others because he's so haywire. So I really don't have a problem having that information referred to whether or not they can own a gun. I take your point, though, that you know, the state is very quick to see danger to the state. That's what happened in all these cases. I just gave you 3. I'm working off a book this thick where there are 200 examples, and they go back to antiquity. You know, when it was spears. Slaughtering your enemies is a time-honored pastime of government. So I do agree with you about that, and it's just a matter of what you do with the information. As I mentioned, you know, when I was in office, I didn't side with the police chiefs over the right of a person to own a gun unless somebody could make a showing. Why not? I believe there are court cases brought by the American Civil Liberties Union on behalf of gun owners for once, and it was settled with some middle of the road, this is what we're going to do with the information. So I want to go back and look at that. That might be a detailed answer to your question. Is this my friend, Vermin Supreme?
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Weld. I'm glad to see you here. I haven't seen you at any libertarian events recently.
Not too recently.
Not too recently. Where's your glitter tie?
I have my glitter tie at home. It's my favorite tie. I'm looking for an occasion to wear it. It's a bright red tie that Berman let me have at an event in Massachusetts not long ago.
Yes.
Autograph.
And my question is this. As you know, the Libertarians have recently started a tradition of raising funds for state parties and for charities by taking pies to the face. And I know the store did not have whipped cream, but they did have snack pudding. And I was wondering if, and we bid on it, and so people could bid on it, and there would be bidding, and we would raise money for the charity of your choice if you will agree to take a pie to the face.
Berman, I'm happy to work with you, including on raising funds for the Libertarian Party, but that's what they call a bad photo op. I don't think that was a duck. I mean, the sound was not a duck. I understood what it was. It was another bird.
Okay, please comment briefly on Trump is the strong leader we need to lead us down the road to surgery.
That's sort of what I was saying in my intro, is, and I don't think he's a strong leader because I don't think he really knows what he's doing, putting one foot in front of the other. I think his head is so filled with rage about something, and it goes back to when he was a kid, and I don't know what it was, but I would not want his demons. And I feel sorry for the man finding himself as President of the United States, a position for which, extremely, excruciatingly demanding position, for which he had no preparation whatsoever. He's been a woman-chasing socialite from New York and Palm Beach his entire life. I'm not surprised that he can't implement policy. But no, I love your point. The strong leader we need to lead us down the road to serve.
Exactly. So
it's always the man on horseback.
So read my t-shirt and comment on it. Out loud. Read it out loud.
Economic cost.
Read it out loud.
Economic cost.
Tariffs.
Oh, tariffs. Tariffs not only impose immense economic costs, but also fail to achieve their primary policy aims and foster political dysfunction along the way. Perhaps you'd care to join my policy team, sir.
So those are the softball questions. Now for the hard question. Why did you endorse Hillary Clinton?
I did not endorse Hillary Clinton. I did not endorse Hillary Clinton. I was on it.
Sure sounded that way to me.
No, well, you know, people say it because they wanted to believe it, because they wanted to trash me. But I said I knew her and I thought she was not a crook. That's not the same as an endorsement. And Donald Trump, you know, nasty woman, crook, lock her up.
Yes.
I don't know. Nobody was saying anything about her except Donna Brazil, who was the head of the Democratic National Committee. Go back and look at the TV spot. Honestly, it's not even close. Sir.
I've been a libertarian since I was a resident of Massachusetts. And I've heard for almost 40 years how libertarians don't have a chance of winning. Some of my fellow attendees have gone so far as to suggest supporting certain Democrat candidates in the primary, so a more desirable Democrat versus someone who does not have much of a chance to win against a chief executive who appears to be loved by his supporters. How would you address why someone should support you versus a Democrat versus a third-party candidate?
Well, my job is to win the New Hampshire primary, first of all. If that happens, I think the president will be politically grievously wounded. This is a small state where you don't need $100 million to compete. You know, my wife and I are going to be renting a place in the deep south, unfortunately, near Manchester, just because it's centrally located, so that we don't even have to go back to Massachusetts at the end of the workday up here. But I plan to meet the voters the way John McCain did, one at a time. It's house party, house party, house party, small event, small event, small event. John McCain in 2000, 2008 had no money. He would get on a plane, Southwest Airlines plane at BWI, fly up here carrying his own suitcase, be met by nobody. This is in the down times of those two races, both of which he won. They were both insurgent campaigns, and John McCain won in both 2000 and 2008. And the man who was chairman of both of those winning campaigns, Peter Spalding, has just recently agreed to be the chairman of my campaign. So he obviously thinks there's a pony in there somewhere. You know, people say to me, how can you possibly win when the Republican State Committee has set its face against you in New Hampshire and even in your own Massachusetts? And Trump's approval with the Republican State Committee members is 96%. And the answer is, of course it is. Those are the Trump organizations in each state, every one of the 50 states. So, you know, as an old duck hunter, I like to go hunting where the ducks are. And my job is to enlarge the electorate who's going to vote in the Republican primaries beyond the party bosses, the Republican State Committee in each state. And this happens to coincide with where I am on the issues. So, you know, when I say we can't refuse to balance our checkbook. Everyone else in the country does it. The federal government has to do it. I did it. I cut spending in real dollars year over year when I was governor. And, you know, I was ranked the most fiscally conservative governor in the United States by the Wall Street Journal and the Cato Institute. And that's as a Republican in Massachusetts. And I cut taxes 21 times, and I never raised them, and our unemployment rate plummeted as a result of that. So, but if you say, you know, we want to not have this deficit, people say, oh, boo, you know, what is that involve? Well, what it involves is Mr. Trump's adding $9 trillion with a T to the deficit in his latest proposal. That mortgage is going to rest right on the shoulders and necks of the millennials. You and I aren't going to pay that debt, but the millennials are not going to get Social Security, and they're not going to have money to fund programs that they need, and they know it. Another issue, climate change, which Mr. Trump has a one word for, is a hoax. Yeah, really? When that polar ice cap melts, guess what's not going to be white anymore? Those mountains right there, because there's not going to be any snow on them. We've already lost the old man in the mountain. That's bad enough, but losing the white mountains being white is not something good either. And all the coastlines are going to be rearranged, and it's going to be havoc. And Mr. Trump is simply not willing to make any payment against the future. It's like he can't think that far ahead to 2030 what the CO2 emissions are going to be. So when I talk about issues like that, when I come out in favor, as I have, for mobile voting, to let people vote with their cell phone, which already recognizes, you know, fingerprint and iris recognition features in the iPhone right today, and you take a selfie of yourself voting, so you can prove, you send it into your voting place, you can prove that you voted this day, and this is me. and they have a copy of your passport or your driver's license on file. I think that's more secure than the current system of no identification required at the polling place. Just think for a second, if mobile voting were permitted, the percentage of millennials voting would go from 49%, which it was last time, to probably 75%, because that's why millennials don't vote. It's too much of a hassle, and they regard the voting place as a source of authority, which they don't really like. This has been shown. So, if I got 75% of millennials voting instead of 49%, that election's not even going to be close against Mr. Trump. I'm winning that election going away. So I'm going to start with the 6 New England states, down to the Mid-Atlantic. Pretty soon, California, Oregon, Washington. Mr. Trump and California don't get along on any topic whatsoever. So I think that's a win. Utah in the West is a win. Mr. Trump got 14% of the vote there in the primary last time. I think I can win the New England states. I think I can win the Mid-Atlantic states. The last question, and I've spent last cycle a lot of time in the Intermountain West states and the Southwest. So the last question is the Rust Belt, and I think I can win Wisconsin. I don't know about Pennsylvania, but that'll be a hell of a fight. So that's the how-to, and that's why to vote the Republican Party primary for me. And anyone can do that. In 17 states, a Democrat can do that. Yes, sir.
If you could flick the switch, change how the presidential election is voted for, so maybe 5 minutes or whatever, what would it be? What would you want to choose?
How the mechanics would change?
Mechanics, yeah.
Well, I'm not one of those who wants to abolish the Electoral College, if that's what you mean. I'd like to reduce the hammerlock that the two major parties seem to have. I'd like to make it easier for third parties to get in there. I know from having run as a libertarian that the two major parties live with no other thought in mind except to deny us ballot access, which I think is not good for letting everybody have their say. And the two parties have outlived their usefulness. They now exist only for the purpose of demonizing each other so they can scare their own base and raise enough money to get reelected. I guess the number one procedural thing I would want is term limits. I was national chair of U.S. term limits when I was in office, and that would address the situation of the R's and the D's in Washington, D.C. And there's an organization called No Labels, which has about 40 members, equally divided Republicans and Democrats, that wants to find solutions to the people's business. Only 40 out of 435 in the House. But that's the way to go. Term limits and institutions that are devoted to finding bipartisan solutions. Because right now, the R's and the D's in Washington, it really isn't working. It still works at the state level, but in Washington, no.
All right, last one. You seem very passionate just now talking about climate change and how it upsets you, but Trump does have the libertarian position on this and not to get involved in the private sector. So how do you change climate change without, at the force of a gun, based on how much CO2 emissions corporations are doing?
Well, what I'm saying is we really can't do nothing. If we do nothing, then the CO2 emissions will take us to plus 2 degrees a year, and the world as we know it has come to an end. So not everything has to be at the barrel of a gun. I know Mr. Trump gets a lot of credit for deregulation, but most of the regulations that he's rolled back are the regulations designed to protect clean air and clean water. And what he wants is to protect coal, which is a couple of states, West Virginia and others, that he won in the last election. I don't have to love that. And okay, so sue me, I'm a lifelong environmentalist, and I say the outdoors is my cathedral, but we got to figure out ways that without being punitive to our own economic growth, and I think that is a factor in deciding exactly what to do. We can't do nothing on climate change and global warming. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bill. Appreciate it.